But I do want to cover one more core concept, and that is the resolver. So we know about the container, and we know about container keys. We know that route::index will give us, a factory for index routes. The resolver is what finds the appropriate ES6 module to get it into the container in the first place. So given a container key, the resolver attempts to find the appropriate JavaScript module in my code base and eventually put it in the container to make it available for us. And the reason we need to do this is because there are many different ways of organizing an Ember app. And over time, the best practice has changed. So before we had Ember CLI and before we had the precursor to Ember CLI, which was called AppKit, it was basically a repository that you would clone. It was sort of your starting point. Predominantly, we would organize our app using a convention built around globals. So for the posts controller, we would just store a controller under the Ember global using posts controller as the name, and the resolver would know that this is where I look. When you ask me for controller::posts, I will look for a global of this name. So when we started to use ES6 modules with AppKit and with Ember CLI, this is sort of the classic way of building an app. It is the most popular way of doing things today. That would be an ES6 module, a separate file under controllers/posts.js. That's where we're going to find the post controller. Somewhere along the way, we had this concept of pods, which I'm glad I circumvented teaching that in the last workshop, because it was sort of an idea that was put forward, but it was not quite ready to roll out. But that would have looked like posts/controller.js. And the idea here was that for posts, you would have the controller there, you would have the route there, and the templates there, all within a folder, all within one unit, which is nice, but there were some edge and corner cases that prevented it from catching on in a huge way. So a new option is becoming available, a new module, grand unification of JavaScript modules concept was vetted through the RFC process, which is the process by which new ideas are decided on and tuned before they're slated for development. So we're going to have a new way of setting up projects. This does not mean that this middle option here is going to break. That's completely valid. Your app does not need to necessarily upgrade to this, but it does open up some new doors for private components that are only available in the context of a parent component. So you could have a form that has inputs available within that form component, but you can't just use an input outside of the context of a form. So that is a very powerful idea. I'm not going to teach it today. I may send Mark a video that we can tack onto this course afterwards. The reason is it is a document and an informal initial spike of what the resolver might look like at this point. It is not something that is fully baked quite yet. But the point is, we don't want all of this complexity to bleed into our app. We just want to say, give me the posts controller and have something go and find it and retrieve it for us, regardless of how we organize things, right? Especially if we're in the transition between two different organizational patterns. So how do we play with the resolver? You're going to grab the application instance again. So you're going to go in the Ember inspector, go into the container, look under type application, select main. So now you're looking at the instance of the Ember application. And you can hit this $E button in the top right corner again, so you get a handle on that instance of an app. And then you can just do $E.resolve registration. And so here you can see at the bottom, I'm basically going through the resolver. I'm saying, give me whatever you have, whatever the resolver is finding under route::index. And it's returning something, and that's the last line in that screenshot there. What I want you to be aware of is this is a function that's being returned. It is the constructor. It is not the instance. So this is literally what that ES6 module is exporting. if you've written, a significant amount of Ember, the common pattern is some core object dot extend. Like that is what you're exporting usually. And what you're exporting is the constructor. You're not creating something in that file. So we're diving deep into modules and how modules work. Occasionally, you may find that you need to define your own module that's sort of a little bit outside the context of your app. And what ES6 modules boil down to is something that looks like this. So this is AMD, named AMD module syntax, where essentially we're passing three things into this define global that's available to us. The first argument here is the name of the module that we are defining here. The second argument is an array of names of modules we are dependent on. So here we're saying, for this module to work, I need the Ember module, right? The third thing is a callback, and arguments that are passed into that callback are the resolved modules that you depended on. So basically in the second argument here in that array, we're asking for Ember, and in the callback, we get Ember. It's part of what that function is called with. It's that argument in that function. Whatever we return from this function, from this callback, that is going to be, that is this module that we're defining here. And so here we're exporting an object that contains a default object, and inside that default object we have some, hello world thing. The reason that we're doing it this way is because the convention with ES6 modules is that you have a default export, and then you can have additional named exports, on top of that default. And we'll explore, what that means in terms of consuming the module, but you usually want to have a default export. It's not required, but this is typical. To consume it, we just need to require it. So require will return that module. The way we bring things like this into our asset pipeline is we go into the Ember CLI build file, and you can have this. There's this API called app.import, and you pass in the name of a file, and then essentially like any modules, any symbols that are exported from the module found, in that file, you have to explicitly say, I want this to be available in my app. The reason that we do this is because potentially you don't need everything in there, and we don't want to just blindly make a whole bunch of stuff available, without you opting in. So there are some new things on the way that should be landing within hopefully the next couple of months that aim to make the build of your app as small as possible. One is called tree shaking, and the idea is that you should be able to get rid of any code in third-party libraries that you don't necessarily need. So if you import Twitter Bootstrap, the whole thing, it's very difficult to determine exactly what's needed and what's not. But if you only say, I need this symbol, I only need tooltip, and I only tooltip and collapse, and that's it, it gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of determining that the rest of it is stuff that can safely be gotten rid of. So how do we peek into modules that have been defined? So there are two cool tricks here. The first here is, so they're both available on this require global, which if we go back, you can see that require is the second half of this define thing. Require and define are sort of the way you create a module and then the way you go and get it later. So on this require global, we have _stats, which will tell you it'll give you some summary as to how many modules you have in your project, how many have been explicitly required by the app, and so on. Require.entries will give you a list. It's basically a JavaScript object, the key being the ES6 module name, and the value is the module itself. This is useful if you import something and you see that it's undefined. You can just go to your console and type require.entries, kind of look through this list. It may be that you've misspelled it or that it's not there at all, and you have to go and make sure that it was exported properly, or maybe you're missing your app.import. But this is a way to kind of get in between a mysterious broken ES6 import and the defining of the module itself. This is where you would be able to see inside that glue that kind of strings everything together. You can see all of the modules there.